All right, guys. Welcome to section 4 of your notes. Just a couple of reminders before we get started. Make sure that you are working on your journal for this week and your Unit 9 documents at 1. Those are due this Friday. Dates to keep in mind, your short paper and your next test, both on March 22nd. What we need to take a look at now is we're going to revisit some of the viewpoints during the 1920s. It's really a pivotal time for us in this decade where our culture is shifting. And we started to see that when we talked about what the impact of working has done, the change to the work week, what is happening with children. But now we need to take a look at sometimes the not so great side. I want to start with the Red Scare. A lot of times when we hear the term the Red Scare, we think of the Red Scare of the 1960s, 50s, 60s. And it is essentially the same idea. The Red Scare is this wave of fear of communists coming to the United States. But this is going to be the first Red Scare that we often forget about. And it's going to take place going into the 1920s, which kind of sets the tone of the 1920s decade. So, where does this come from? This comes from the communist revolts that are going to be happening in Central and Eastern Europe. Think of the Bolshevik Revolution. We talked about Russia leaving World War I, the United States entering, and that being a massive shift for the war. But we didn't really address why Russia was leaving. Russia left World War I because there was a revolution happening in their home front. That revolution was a communist takeover. And when we see this successful communist revolution, the United States gets really nervous. And where the nerves really come from is labor strikes in the United States. This is going to cause fear among Americans that a successful communist revolution would happen here because labor is where the Bolshevik strike kind of started as well. This idea of socialism kind of hangs out with the labor strikes because laborers are asking for equality when it comes to the economy, more government control when it comes to business and the economy. And that is something that creates fear in Americans. So, when we define the Red Scare, it is a wave of fear of suspected communists and radicals that would be plotting revolutions within the United States to overthrow our government. The Palmer Raids. When we look to the reaction of the United States, some of that can be found in the example of the Palmer Raids. The fear is really going to take a shift to violence in 1919. It begins with this idea of the Palmer Raids. Uh, the Attorney General at the time, A. Mitchell Palmer, is going to initiate these Palmer raids. And it is what it sounds like. Think of what a raid might be. If somebody raids your home, they come in, they're looking for something. What were we looking for, according to A. Mitchell Palmer? We were looking for suspected communists in the United States. The problem here is they are just targeting immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe where we believed communists were coming from. It comes from this, the violence out of 1919. There were anarchists, there was a series of anarchist bombings that were targeting law enforcement and government officials. The bombs went off in a number of cities in Boston and Cleveland and Philadelphia and DC and New York City. And it pushed the attorney general to make a move. And what he does is he orders a series of very violent law enforcement raids that were targeting leftist radicals and anarchists. The problem was they didn't really these raids didn't really result from any evidence. They also didn't result in finding a lot of communists. But what these raids do is it kicks off what becomes known as the Red Summer. And we briefly started talking about the Red Summer yesterday. Um, and I want to delve into it just a little bit more, and I promise I won't go too far here. But it is this result of a growing tension in the United States between uh, the different racial groups that we have. It's the Great Migration taking place, moving to the northern cities during World War One. It's the tension that continued to build in regard to the Red Scare. It ultimately results in um, these violent uprisings in the cities, and I want to take a look here, and just take a listen. Tell me, we are going to turn and talk to your seat partner there. Talk about what the root causes of the Red Summer were, what's the connection to World War One, and what is the impact of this event.
The summer of 1919 is the crest of one of the most vicious years in American history. There are riots that just kind of sweep the nation. They're not just Southern riots. Not only have segregation and the underlying ethos of Jim Crow gone national, but the commitment to reinforcing and defending them through terroristic violence is also national.
Jim Crow was following the Great Migration northward, and both had landed in Chicago. In the last 2 years alone, an estimated 50,000 black people had arrived in the city, almost doubling Chicago's African-American population. New arrivals crowded up uneasily against a huge influx of immigrants fleeing Southern and Eastern Europe. Those European migrants were divided by religion, language, and ethnicity, but they held one thing in common: an antipathy toward black people. Business owners exploited racial tensions, frequently using black workers to undercut wages and break strikes.
Marian Anderson travels to Chicago in 1919 as basically a powder keg. And it has many of the conditions that you'll see in cities across the country. There's pressure on housing. There's competition over jobs. There are returning soldiers, black and white. Black soldiers angry about their World War I experience and convinced that they've earned their full citizenship rights. And white soldiers determined to keep African Americans from acting on their convictions.
On the afternoon of July 27th, 14-year-old Eugene Williams was killed when his raft drifted into the white section of the 29th Street beach. A policeman refused to arrest his assailant. Fights broke out between black and white bystanders.
So I want you to turn to your seat partner there, and I'm going to give you about a minute and a half here and talk about what were the root causes of the Red Summer, what's the connection to World War One, and what is the impact of the Red Summer on the United States. Okay, when you think about the Red Scare, I want you to think about two pieces happening at the same time because you have the Red Scare in the United States and you have the Red Summer also happening, this culmination of tensions because of the shift in World War One that has been caused here. Um, I want to take a little look at this political cartoon here. When we look at the political cartoon, we see the threat of the Bolsheviks, the anarchist, the danger being here, and the purpose of this political cartoon is going to be to strike fear in the United States. The point of view of the political cartoonist, anarchism and the Bolsheviks are bad, they're dangerous. And the audience of this cartoon is the people in the United States. So, this pushing of the fear of the threat of violence, the threat of the overthrow of our democracy. And really, when you take a look at the whole of the 1920s, it's going to be just the threat of the other again. It's the same song and dance that we've had the entire time we've been studying. If you are not a white American, then you are dangerous. Any other background, any other tradition or culture that you bring to the United States is dangerous. So, this is going to kind of culminate in a few different pieces here, but I want to look at a court case first. When we look at the effect of the Red Scare, we are looking at the tensions and the ultimately the build of dislike for immigrants coming to the United States. And the representation of this is the trial of Sacco and Vanzetti. What's going to end up happening is Sacco and Vanzetti are going to be arrested because they were believed to have committed murder. If we rewind a little bit, it's going to sound a little like an episode of Dateline, but there was a robbery, and in that robbery, there was someone that was carrying a bank bag from a shoe store. They had a big deposit to take to the bank, and as they were coming out, they were shot and killed. And witnesses of the event said that they had seen two Italian men. They spotted the getaway car, and that information from that eyewitness is going to lead police to Sacco and Vanzetti. What's going to end up happening is these two men were also known not only as Italian immigrants, but known anarchists. Um, they are going to be tried and found guilty of killing the men in the robbery. The problem with this case is that there was very little evidence to suggest that these guys were actually guilty. Really, the only evidence they had was the gun, and I know in today's time that sounds like a lot of evidence, but in the 1920s, you have to take away the information and the technology that we have today. There weren't really good ballistic tests to do. Fingerprinting, matching the fingerprints is not like it is today, where you pop it into the computer and a software does it for you. So the evidence that they did have would have convicted these guys, but it's the sentencing to death that is a little beyond what people imagined. And that's going to draw the attention of the American Civil Liberties Union, or the ACLU. This group is going to form in the early 1920s in response to the Red Scare to protect the rights of the American people. If you look at their name, it is Civil Liberties Union. What does a union do? It protects and fights for rights. Whose rights are they fighting for? Americans. So the American Civil Liberties Union. They are going to defend Sacco and Vanzetti in this case, and ultimately, the murder conviction stands, the death sentence stands. This case becomes known as extremely controversial and really representative of the time because they were charged based more on political views and wanting to make an example of immigrants at the time than they were on facts of the crime. And it really represents the nativist attitudes of the nation against immigrants in the 1920s. And we have to look at this trial as more representative of saying we're going to make an example when immigrants break the law, or if immigrants are going to be dangerous to Americans, then this is the extreme that we will take it to. And Sacco and Vanzetti were ultimately executed for these murders. Again, it's the same attitude that we've seen before. It's the same um, attitude that we see now. When we talk nativism, these pieces are going to sound very familiar. During this time, when we define nativism again, it's native born citizens are favored over immigrants. This idea is going to be strengthened by World War I. The Russian Revolution, the Red Scare, really pushes us into this nativist attitude. And we're going to see some of the pieces of nativist legislation passed that we've talked about before. First, the Emergency Quota Act is going to be passed in 1921. That is going to be solidified by the National Origins Act in 1924. The Emergency Quota Act establishes the quota system, setting up how many immigrants or what percentage of the population can be made up by immigrants from certain countries. The National Origins Act officially and sets that quota system for uh, the the longitude of it, giving it life for a significant amount of time. The National Origins Act does not apply to Mexico. During this time, we are going to see. I don't really like the word emergence of the Ku Klux Klan. I guess reemergence or regrowth is a better way to put it. The Ku Klux Klan is going to form in opposition or really grow in opposition at this time, not only to African Americans, but to labor unions. They are very anti immigrant. They are anti Catholic, anti Jewish. They are very against the other. If you were not a white Anglo Saxon Protestant in the United States, then the Ku Klux Klan was against you. And they really are against this idea of the melting pot theory that we had talked about, the blending of all of these different cultures to form a I don't know, better United States, a better culture, a more rich culture. So you really see this push for the Ku Klux Klan at the time as well. And all of these attitudes are coming to a head underneath the surface of what we typically study in the 1920s. So you have the Red Summer introducing us to the decade of the 1920s. You also have the Red Scare introducing us to the decade of the 1920s. Um, to continue on with a little bit more of society at the time, we need to go back to Prohibition because now we are actually in the time period of Prohibition. Remember the temperance movement, the Women Christian Temperance Union is going to be what pushes for Prohibition to ultimately be passed. They had some really poor timing on the 18th Amendment here. The 18th Amendment is going to take effect in 1919, and we mark the period of Prohibition from 1920 to 1933. In 1933 is going to be when FDR ultimately gets the 21st Amendment passed, reversing the Prohibition Amendment. Now, we talked a little bit before when we introduced Prohibition, but it is incredibly ineffective. Uh, During the 1920s, we saw some rights expanding, some freedoms expanding, some culture expanding, but it also is the time period where we see some rights being curtailed, and that's where the 18th Amendment comes in. The 18th Amendment specifically bans the manufacturing and sale of liquor. And that's very specific in that it doesn't say you can't sell it. It just says you can't, oh, it does say you can't sell it. It says you can't manufacture it. So that means you can drink it, right? So where this comes from is the Volstead Act. You may see that passed, Volstead, Volstead Act. It closed every tavern, every bar, every saloon in the United States because that's where alcohol was being sold. But what's going to form in reaction to this is organized crime. You're going to have bootleggers who are making their own alcohol. You're going to have speakeasies who are just bars that go underground. You will have the mob form, an organized way of selling and distributing alcohol throughout the United States. The people who were drinking it were not breaking the law. The people who were selling it and distributing it were. So it really just pushed this underground. And you and I both know that when something is not monitored by the government, it becomes very dangerous. So the alcohol during this time period, it really made people ill. When we talked about it the first time, people could go blind from some of the alcohol that was being pushed. But at this time, that's when you see the racketeers come out. Other organized crime figures like Al Capone are going to come out. Um, it really puts weaponry on the streets with the organized crime. And a lot of these, as we would call them at the time, gangsters, are going to have police on their payroll because police are not getting paid enough to monitor and regulate the 18th Amendment. So they'll oftentimes be bought into organized crime, and that's where the money is. So you have police who are not even policing the 18th Amendment because oftentimes they sided with the people. So we are going to see that prohibition is taking place all throughout the 1920s and really not being followed by the people. The last case that I want to bring to you today is the Scopes Monkey Trial. I want you to take a listen here and just tell me what you think the Scopes Monkey Trial represented, and then I'll go backwards and tell you about the case.
John Scopes, a young teacher of Tennessee, had taught, contrary to state law, Darwin's theory of evolution. The Tennessee country people believed this was contrary to biblical doctrine. And Scopes' trial got worldwide publicity, with the Tennessee fundamentalists lined up against the liberals and intellectuals of America. William Jennings Bryan, old and full of oratory, defended the beliefs of the fundamentalists. He was aided by the prosecuting zeal of old Judge Ben McKenzie, a local politician influential in the area, who helped to make the trial an inquisition. The courtroom was packed as the case reached a climax. Arthur Garfield Hayes, defending Scopes, explained Darwin's theory of evolution, and Dudley Field Malone, another liberal, added his plea for tolerance to the cause of freedom of thought. Then the defense threw in another artful veteran, Clarence Darrow, for what turned out to be the cross-examination of Bryan. Darrow, in a shirt-sleeves analysis, reduced the elder statesman's antiquated ideas to intellectual rubble.
After the closing remarks, Judge Ralston charged the jury, and they retired for their deliberations on a verdict. On the day of the announced decision, the two opposing sides waited calmly in the courtroom. The jury foreman, Captain Jack Thompson, delivered the verdict of guilty as charged. John Scopes received the decree of his $100 fine without any outward show of bitterness. 2 years later, the decision was to be reversed in the Appellate Court of Appeals. William Jennings Bryan died 5 days after the end of the famous trial. Although victorious in the courtroom, he and the fundamentalist cause had been destroyed. The encounter in Dayton, Tennessee, had solved the basic struggle of thinking and education in the modern-day world.
Okay, so I want you to take a second, turn to your partner sitting next to you, and talk about what do you think the Scopes trial represents in this decade of the 1920s? All right, let's debrief a little bit. So, the Scopes monkey trial is going to occur right in the middle of the decade of the 1920s in 1925, and it begins with Charles Darwin's theory of evolution. If you recall, the theory of evolution tells us that we evolved over time from monkeys or apes or whatever it might be. And at the time, there's going to be this fight within the United States of this traditional culture versus the evolving culture of the 1920s. And there's a lot of people who believed that there should not be evolution taught in schools. It should not be something that is utilized in the curriculum. And in the state of Tennessee, they were able to pass in the House of Representatives a law called the Butler Act. And the Butler Act made it illegal for you to teach evolution in schools. When the American Civil Liberties Union hears of the Butler Act being passed, they believe that this is against the civil liberties of the people of the United States because, yes, we have freedom of religion, but we also have freedom from religion, meaning that you can't cover up those that believe the opposite of what religion says. So the American Civil Liberties Union is going to hear that this bill has been passed, and immediately it is going to set out to challenge the Butler Act. Now, I don't encourage this at all, but if you want to prove that a law is bad, you have to break it, and then you go through the court system and you prove that it is faulty. So that's exactly what the American Civil Liberty Union did. They are going to find a high school science teacher in Tennessee that is willing enough to stick their neck out there and teach evolution. And the person that they found was John Scopes. He is going to openly admit that he taught evolution in his classroom, which gets him arrested under the Butler Act. And he is kind of wishy-washy. It's interesting to look at. Scopes was a physics and math teacher, but he also said that he had accepted evolution. He didn't really teach biology, but he said that he did include it. He wasn't really the best guy, but Tennessee didn't care. As long as he admitted to teaching evolution, they could arrest him. So it is going to hit the newspapers when he is arrested, and it's going to draw the attention of a couple really famous lawyers that you saw in the video there. William Jennings Bryan, who had 3 times tried to run for the president, is going to be the prosecution. He is a very well known fundamentalist, Christian fundamentalist, meaning he believes in the fundamentals. He's very anti evolution. And then he is going to face off with Clarence Darrow, who was a famous attorney that will represent John Scopes on the side of the American Civil Liberties Union. And this case really grows in attention because Darrow and William Jennings Bryan go at each other really personally. And Darrow set out to kind of debunk Christian fundamentalists and raise awareness of how narrow fundamentalists interpret the Bible and how that can't impact what laws are being passed or what education is being provided to our students. Darrow even put William Jennings Bryan on the stand and made him answer questions about his belief system. And that drew the attention all across the country. And this case really comes to represent the clash between the culture that was changing in the 1920s and the traditional, more religious side that remained. Ultimately, at the end of this trial, John Scopes is found guilty. He did break the Butler Act. He's going to be forced to pay a fine, but eventually it will be overturned, as you heard in the video. It leads to other states attempting to pass similar laws, and it at the time there were 22 other states that made similar efforts to pass similar laws. Um, but what's going to end up happening is this controversy of teaching science and evolution is not over. It has continued into the 21st century. In 2005, there was a case in Pennsylvania that talked about teaching intelligent design. The court ultimately ruled against intelligent design, uh, now known as pseudoscience. But it is a topic that has been kind of included over time. You think of this as an old case, but it is something that we revisited as recently. I know this was almost 20 years ago, in 2005. But ultimately, the case of the Scopes Monkey trial represents this clash between culture evolving and the traditional side. And that really is what the 1920s were. They are this clash of the people that are trying to move forward and the people who are trying to stay the same. And it includes all of the pieces. If we go backwards, it includes women trying to evolve and the traditional society trying to hold them back. It includes the African American culture trying to move forward with the Harlem Renaissance and ultimately being held back by the Red Summer and the violence subjected against them. It's that moving forward with immigrants coming to the United States but being held back with the Red Scare and the nativist legislation that's being passed. I'm going to say it again. It's the time that where we're trying to move forward with a move away from religion, but you see the Scopes Monkey trial holding us back and trying to keep that really traditional side of the United States strong. So I wanted to try to debunk your original whether you held it or not, but the original way that the 1920s is often presented as this shift in American culture where everybody changed and moved to a more modern way of thinking. But that's not exactly what was happening. The tradition in the United States is still very strong, and ultimately we were clashing between those that wanted to move forward and evolve in our culture and those that really wanted to stay the same. Tomorrow we are going to begin the Great Depression, so buckle up for some economics talk tomorrow. If you have any questions on anything, please let me know, and make sure that your notes make it into your journal.